In our last lesson, we investigated how animals interact with and respond to their environment through behavior. Well, plants exhibit behaviors as well, and in this video, we're going to explore several important types of plant behavior. Let's start with an overview. As you can see, this plant is responding to a change in the environment. And those changes in the environment could be changes in light, humidity, temperature, the presence of herbivores, all sorts of things. And the behavior is usually regulated by hormones and other internal signal molecules, just like behaviors in animals. And these behaviors are adaptive. They help plants survive on land, and they are subject to natural selection. So plants that exhibit behaviors that are more adaptive are going to survive and reproduce more successfully. The first behavior we're going to look at is phototropism, which we've studied in the past, so we won't spend long on it. Phototropism is simply the growth of a shoot in response to the presence or absence of light. In many cases, it's positive phototropism. Plants will usually grow towards light because this is adaptive. It maximizes the exposure of leaves to light so that they can perform photosynthesis. Now, what's the mechanism behind this behavior? How does it work? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that the tips of plants, the top of the shoot, contains a special tissue called apical meristem tissue. And this tissue is important because it is responsible for growth. And one way it does that is by producing the hormone auxin. So let's see what happens. In the response to sunlight, auxin ends up being in high concentrations on the dark side of the shoot. And what the auxin does is it causes the cells on the dark side to elongate, and that will bend the stem towards the light. Meanwhile, the cells on the light side remain a normal size. Now, this is one proposed mechanism, but recent studies have found a different mechanism in certain plants. And this mechanism involves growth inhibitors. And what scientists have learned is that in some plants, the cells on the light side actually have high concentrations of these growth inhibitors, which prevents them from elongating, while the dark side can elongate in response to auxin. The next behavior we're going to look at is circadian rhythms, and this is something present in both animals and plants. So essentially, a circadian rhythm is just a 24-hour cycle of behavior. For example, plants, much like animals, sleep during the night, usually. Plants will also open their stomata during the day and close them in the evening. So they are on a 24-hour cycle that corresponds to night and day. Now, how does this work? What's the mechanism behind it? Well, you might think that light and darkness trigger the behavior, but it's actually regulated by internal mechanisms, internal timekeepers called biological clocks. And these are found in the cells of plants as well as animals. Scientists don't know exactly how it works, but they think what might happen is that there's a protein in plants that regulates its own production by negative feedback. So at the beginning of day, when light is first outside, there's not a lot of this protein present. So the protein expression turns on and protein is produced. Once it hits significant levels, maybe towards the end of the day, the protein expression turns off. The protein shuts down transcription and translation. So levels start to drop during the night. And then once they get low at night, protein expression turns back on, and they hit their significant peak, and then they turn back off. The interesting thing, though, is that if you take away the sunlight and put the plant in continuous darkness, it will still show the same circadian rhythm. So this is evidence that it's an internal mechanism that's regulating it. However, if you notice, even though the cycle is still there, there's a little bit of a change in terms of how long the period happens for. So even though it's regulated by internal clocks, the light and dark cues of the day keep the clock perfectly synchronized. So they keep the clock at exactly 24 hours. And if you change the amount of light and dark exposure, you can change the length of the circadian rhythm. Now, in this case, what it does to the plant is it changes the circadian rhythm to 26 hours instead of 24. But for people who get jet lag, and plants can get jet lag too, because of that big time change and the difference in dark and light, it can really upset your circadian rhythms and your biological clocks. A related behavior is called photoperiodism. And photoperiodism is just what it sounds like. A photoperiod is the relative length of day and night. So a long photoperiod means a lot of light during the day, and a short photoperiod means not a lot of light during the day. And we know that this changes throughout the year. Photoperiods are longer in the summer than they are in the winter. So there are two different groups of plants. And depending on which type they are, it determines when they flower. You've probably noticed that a lot of plants have flowers in the spring. Well, the reason has to do with what type of plant they are. Short day plants flower when the light period shortens. In other words, in late summer, fall, and winter. And here's what that looks like. Once the day length, which is in yellow, falls to a short enough period, and the night length is long enough, they'll start to flower. However, the flowers we're starting to see bloom right now are long day plants. They flower when the light period lengthens, like spring or early summer. So once the day period gets long enough, boom, we get flowers. Now, how does this work? How does a plant know when there's more daylight or less daylight? They don't have brains after all. But they do have special proteins called phytochromes. And these are proteins that have a light-absorbing pigment. And this pigment monitors the photoperiod. It monitors how much daylight there is. And the way it does that is by changing back and forth between two forms, PR and PFR. PR will absorb red light during the day from the sun. And as it absorbs that red light, it gets converted into PFR. Meanwhile, PFR, at the end of the day, will absorb far red light, that's what FR stands for, and it will be converted back to PR during the course of the night. And scientists think that what might be happening is that the PFR form acts as a transcription factor, turning on or off gene expression, and that might control flowering. The last behavior we're going to look at is water balance. In the leaves of plants, there are openings called stoma. And the stoma are important because that's how carbon dioxide enters, and it's how water exits. Now, opening and closing the stomata is an important adaptation for water regulation. For example, at night, the cells on either side of the stoma, the guard cells, will close the openings to conserve water, because at night there's no light for photosynthesis, so it doesn't make sense to keep the stoma open. Why build up CO2 if you can't do anything with it? Meanwhile, during the day, the guard cells will open the stoma, and unfortunately that means some water will be lost, but it's an important trade-off because the plant has got to take in CO2 to make food through photosynthesis. Now, what's the mechanism behind this? Well, it's pretty cool. Here's the stoma when they're open. Here are the guard cells, here's the stoma. What happens when the stoma is open is that potassium ions are being actively pumped inside the guard cells. Now, because there's so much potassium in there and not a lot of water, water will naturally enter the guard cells by osmosis, and that will make the guard cells turgid, and they will bend, opening the stoma. Meanwhile, when they close, the potassium ions are actively pumped out. You can see there's tons of potassium ions outside. And that causes water to leave the guard cell by osmosis, and that makes the guard cells flaccid. And so now that they're not bent, they close the opening. And scientists think that there are a few cues for this. Sunlight, low carbon dioxide, and the biological clocks can all trigger the pumping in of potassium that makes the guard cells turgid and opens the stoma. And that concludes our investigation of important plant behaviors.